He lived for 18 years in the shadows, wearing a security guard uniform, hiding a secret worth billions. Even his own son didn't know the truth, but everything changed the night he showed up at a high school reunion, and someone tried to throw him out of a restaurant. They had no idea who they were messing with. Grayson Bennett had everything a man could dream of: wealth that spanned continents, a wife he adored more than life itself, and a newborn son he swore to protect with every breath. At 40, he was already one of the richest individuals in the country, a visionary tech magnate whose empire was whispered about in boardrooms and broadcast across financial networks. But all the wealth in the world couldn't save the one thing that mattered most. It happened on a rain-slicked Tuesday afternoon. Grayson had just ended a global video conference when the call came in. His wife, Eleanor, had been in a car crash. A drunk driver had skipped a red light and slammed into her sedan head-on. She died on the scene. She was 32. Their son, Jamie, was only 5. That day, Grayson Bennett ceased to exist. The headlines mourned him as a recluse, a grieving billionaire who vanished without a trace. In reality, Grayson carefully orchestrated his own disappearance. The world saw it as grief spiraling into self-exile, but he saw it as survival. The world of yachts, private jets, and luxury penthouses felt grotesque in the shadow of Eleanor's absence. So, he did the unthinkable. He signed over his empire to a trusted board of directors, arranged legal proxies and blind trusts, and retreated into a life no one would suspect. With the help of a few discreet connections, he re-emerged weeks later under the name Greg Bell, a widowed man with no record, no assets, and no interest in ambition. And he took a job as a night shift security guard at a municipal service building in a modest city district. The suit and tie were replaced by a dull gray uniform. The glass office towers gave way to fluorescent-lit corridors and steel doors. His workspace was a cramped booth with a flickering monitor and a two-way radio. He went from meetings with presidents to checking IDs at the gate, from gala events to nodding silently at janitors on their way in and out. And yet, Grayson had never felt closer to something real. He raised Jamie in a small rented apartment, where they lived modestly but with quiet purpose. There was no house staff, no limousines, no extravagant toys, just a father and son navigating life one day at a time. Jamie grew up believing his father was a humble man, one who worked hard to make ends meet. And in truth, Greg Bell was exactly that. Grayson could have revealed the truth at any moment, but he never did. He wanted Jamie to grow into his own man, without the burden of legacy or the illusion of inherited greatness. He didn't want his son to be known as the heir of an empire. He wanted him to be a builder of his own. And so, each night after dinner, while Jamie did his homework, Grayson would quietly track the global markets, monitor investments through hidden accounts, and ensure his empire was still running smoothly from the shadows. He donated millions anonymously, supporting hospitals, scholarships, and victims of drunk driving, all in Eleanor's name. But during the day, he was just Greg, a quiet, dependable man who brewed his own coffee and brought extra sandwiches for the custodians. No one suspected his true identity. He was friendly but distant, always courteous, always early to work. A ghost of a man living among the unnoticed. Jamie, meanwhile, grew into a teenager with ambition burning in his eyes. He worked part-time jobs, excelled in school, and never once asked for more than they could afford. Grayson taught him discipline, humility, and resilience, not through words, but through example. And Jamie watched. By the time Jamie was 16, he had already launched an online business from their shared laptop. By 19, it had turned profitable. At 21, he declined college scholarships and launched a tech startup with a handful of friends, pooling together every dollar he had earned. Grayson never interfered, never offered help beyond encouragement, but he watched, and he was proud. The boy, who once thought his father was poor, now ran a company worth millions. But he still treated Grayson with the same quiet respect. He still cooked breakfast on Sundays, still asked his dad how his shift went, still offered to repair their old radiator without complaint. And Grayson never stopped watching from the shadows. The years passed, and Jamie's influence grew. By 25, he was on the cover of business magazines. Investors sought him out. He expanded his business into hospitality, acquiring a chain of upscale restaurants, including one called Lux Mirador, a name that Grayson remembered Eleanor had once suggested during a vacation in Spain. Jamie didn't know his father had once owned the building. He didn't know Grayson had discreetly helped guide the sale. Now, Grayson was nearing 60. His beard had turned silver, his face lined with years of quiet grief and reflection. He still worked as a security guard in the same building, his uniform pressed, his eyes alert. No one knew his story. No one ever asked. And he preferred it that way, but everything changed with a simple envelope. It arrived one morning in his mailbox, an invitation to the 40th high school reunion of Lincoln High School, class of 1985. Grayson hadn't seen those names in decades. Most of them had no idea where he had gone. Some likely assumed he had died. Others probably never cared. He almost threw it away, but something held him still. A quiet pull, a voice that sounded like Eleanor's whispering from the past. Maybe, he thought, it was time to revisit the world he had left behind. Not as a billionaire, not as a ghost, but as the man he had become. Greg Bell. A man no one remembered, a man no one respected, a man they would all underestimate. And so, he circled the date on the calendar, ironed his uniform, polished his old boots, and prepared to walk into a room full of people who had long since forgotten him, not knowing that the son they would all soon meet had become the very king of the world they worshipped, not knowing that Greg Bell had never stopped being Grayson Bennett. He just chose to be more. From the earliest days of his childhood, Jamie Bennett had lived a life defined not by luxury, but by something far more formative: discipline. He woke up each day to the sound of his father boiling water for oatmeal, the radio playing soft jazz in the background, and the unmistakable hum of structure. While other children bragged about vacations to Paris or their newest gadgets, Jamie had learned to take pride in simpler things, waking up early, working hard, and doing what needed to be done even when no one was watching. His father, Greg Bell, as he believed him to be, was a man of few words and many habits. He never raised his voice. He never arrived late. He never bought things they didn't need, but every now and then he would say something quietly, something that stuck with Jamie far longer than any lesson from a teacher. Like, "There's no shortcut worth taking if it makes you forget who you are," or "Build what no one can take from you, not just a business, but your name." Jamie carried these mantras like secret blueprints. By the time he was 12, he was reading business books from the public library. At 14, he convinced his school to let him intern during the summer at a local startup. At 16, he was coding his own platforms, using borrowed time on school computers and free internet at a cafe. The old laptop he shared with his father was held together with tape, but it was more valuable to Jamie than gold. Grayson, still Greg in every aspect of his daily life, never intervened. He watched quietly, always from the edges, sometimes with pride swelling in his chest so fiercely that he had to excuse himself just to breathe. He wanted Jamie to rise, not because of who his father had been, but because of who he was becoming. And rise he did. By 20, Jamie had turned a simple digital consulting service into a full-fledged enterprise. He didn't ask his father for a cent. Not that he knew he could. All he had was a mind sharpened by adversity and the heart of a man who had seen humility firsthand. When Jamie raised his first $100,000 from angel investors, he brought home a pizza and a bottle of cheap cider and shared it with his dad on their small kitchen table. His father said only 3 words, "Well done, son." But the way he looked at Jamie said everything. Grayson knew then that his son had chosen the right path. Soon, Jamie's name began appearing in local business circles. His startup, focused on AI-driven hospitality management, began expanding rapidly. But, unlike many young tech millionaires, Jamie didn't seek fast fame. He declined every lavish party, every influencer meeting. Instead, he reinvested profits, bought up struggling businesses, and rebuilt them from the inside out. That's how he came across Lux Mirador. It was a Phelan restaurant, once glamorous but now mismanaged. Jamie saw potential, not just in the building, but in the brand. What he didn't know was that his father had once secretly helped develop that property decades earlier, under a different name. The moment Jamie walked through the doors, Grayson felt the weight of history settle on his chest. He had said nothing. He simply smiled and listened as Jamie explained his vision. Jamie renovated it from the ground up, keeping the name, redesigning the menu, and hiring new staff, many of whom were the children of people who had once worked with Grayson. Irony twisted through every corner of the story, but it was never forced. It simply happened that way, like life was trying to tie up a long, forgotten thread. Soon, Lux Mirador wasn't just a restaurant. It became a brand. A symbol of modern luxury led by old-school values. And Jamie, he became a symbol too. At 26, he was one of the youngest hospitality tycoons in the country. His face was rarely seen on magazine covers, but his name appeared in financial reports, startup panels, and Forbes watch lists. He remained modest, often saying in interviews that his greatest role model was his dad, a hard-working man who taught him everything about integrity. He never elaborated. He never knew the full truth. By then, Jamie had employed hundreds, among them many graduates struggling to find work in a competitive world. In fact, several employees at Lux Mirador were the sons of Grayson's former classmates. One young man, Trevor Hill, worked in the kitchen, never knowing that the Greg, who occasionally stopped by with a warm nod, was the same man his own father used to bully in school. Grayson recognized the names. He saw the faces of the past reshaped into new generations, but he never spoke of it. He simply watched. And then came the invitation. Jamie found it lying on the kitchen table one morning, the envelope with the golden seal of Lincoln High School. "Is this for you?" he asked. Grayson took it with a faint smile. "Yes. They still send those out?" "You should go," Jamie said. "Could be fun." Grayson raised an eyebrow. "You think it's fun to watch people pretend they were nicer than they really were?" Jamie chuckled. "You don't have to stay long. Just show them what dignity looks like." That night, Grayson ironed his uniform, the same gray security shirt he'd worn for nearly 2 decades. Not out of irony, not out of spite, but because it was who he had chosen to be. He looked at himself in the mirror, older now, slower in movement, but with a presence that had only deepened. His son had become everything he'd hoped for, not because of privilege, but because of character. He had once feared Jamie would resent him for not offering riches. But now Jamie was a man of fortune, not from inheritance, but from legacy. He had built it on the foundation of quiet sacrifice. Grayson would go to that reunion. He wouldn't speak of money or power. He wouldn't mention his past, because his greatest accomplishment wasn't being one of the richest men in the country. It was sitting in the next room, drafting a hiring strategy, preparing to mentor young entrepreneurs, and that man still called him Dad. As Grayson left the apartment and walked into the night air, he felt something shift, not in the world, but within. The time was drawing near. The past would collide with the present. And soon, very soon, the world would see not just who Grayson had been, but who his son had become. The night of the reunion arrived wrapped in a quiet chill. Grayson Bennett, still known to the world around him as Greg Bell, stepped into the dimly lit community center gymnasium that had once hosted his high school dances. The same cheap folding chairs, the same wax-polished floors, the same banner over the entrance. Welcome back, Lincoln High, class of '85. Everything felt like a paused memory, pressed between the pages of time and only now reopened. No one recognized him at first. He had expected that. Decades had passed. Hairlines had receded. Guts had expanded. The popular boys were now thinning at the crown and thick around the waist, still calling each other by their teenage nicknames as though nothing had changed. The girls, once queens of the hallways, had retreated into polite smiles, real estate licenses, and an occasional Botox appointment. Grayson stood at the edges, sipping black coffee from a paper cup. His security uniform drew glances, but no one approached him with curiosity, only polite, dismissive nods, the kind reserved for someone perceived as part of the help. Then the whispers began. "Isn't that?" "No, couldn't be. Why would he even show up?" "Greg Bell, he's still around?" One man in particular, Douglas Hill, took great pleasure in making his presence known. A former football player turned mid-level construction executive, Douglas still spoke with the same cocky edge he had in high school. His son, Trevor, now worked quietly in the kitchens of Lux Mirador, though Douglas had no idea the restaurant belonged to Grayson's son. Douglas approached, drink in hand, smirk stretched across his aging face. "Greg Bell," he said, loud enough for nearby ears to turn. "I'll be damned. Still wearing that rent-a-cop costume? You know this is a reunion for alumni, not for staff." A few chuckles echoed. Someone coughed awkwardly. Grayson simply smiled. "Even the staff have memories." Douglas leaned in mockingly. "Well, it's good to know some people never change. Still taking orders, huh?" Grayson didn't flinch. "Still giving them without earning them?" Douglas's grin faltered slightly, but he brushed it off with a laugh. "Oh, you're a funny one." The night carried on. Old yearbooks were passed around. Awards were reminisced. No one mentioned Eleanor, the only girl Grayson had ever loved. Gone now, her name never spoken in this room that had once watched her dance under paper streamers. Eventually, someone shouted over the music, "Hey, let's go celebrate properly. There's that new fancy place, Lux Mirador. First round's on me." Grayson's eyes lifted slightly. The world always had a strange sense of timing. They moved as a noisy caravan of luxury cars and overconfident voices. Grayson, without a word, texted his driver. A sleek black Maybach pulled to the curb in front of Lux Mirador, its glossy surface reflecting the city lights like polished obsidian. Grayson stepped out calmly, the passenger door opened by a uniformed chauffeur who nodded with silent deference. The others had just arrived, stepping out of SUVs and sedans, laughing until they saw him. The laughter stopped. Douglas blinked, pointing. "Wait, that's Greg?" A woman beside him whispered. "Who's driving that car? He's got a chauffeur." Grayson met their stares with a quiet nod. "Friend of mine. Likes to see me arrive in style every now and then." He offered no further explanation. Inside the restaurant, everything gleamed. Brass fixtures, modern lighting, fine linen, and a subtle ambiance of understated power. The maitre d' greeted Grayson with warmth. "Mr. Bell, welcome back. Your table is ready." The reunion group hesitated. One asked, "They know you here?" Grayson smiled. "I come here sometimes. Good food, better values." The group was seated at a long reserved table near the windows. Most were too uncomfortable to make eye contact with him now. Douglas tried to regain dominance by ordering the most expensive bottle of wine and chuckling loudly at his own jokes. But something had shifted. The atmosphere was charged. And then the moment came. Douglas, half drunk, pointed at Grayson across the table. "You know what? This is ridiculous. Why's a security guard eating here with us? Who even let him in?" He stood up, gesturing sharply. "Hey, somebody get management over here. This guy doesn't belong." He didn't finish. Two tall security officers approached from the side, summoned by a silent cue. Their eyes locked onto Grayson, and they moved quickly toward him. "Sir," one of them said, "I'm going to have to ask you." Grayson turned slowly. The second guard froze mid-sentence. Both stared. Then one of them swallowed hard. "Mr. Bennett, I didn't recognize." The first one straightened. "Apologies, sir. We didn't realize." Douglas gawked. "Bennett, what the hell are you talking about?" The head of security turned to him, voice suddenly sharp. "Step back, sir." The air dropped. Everyone stared. Grayson calmly placed his napkin on the table and rose to his feet. "No need for a scene," he said softly. "I'm just here to enjoy the night." Douglas was pale now, confused, furious. "What's going on? Who the hell are you really?" But the answer didn't come from Grayson. It came from across the restaurant, where a young man in a tailored suit had just entered. Jamie Bennett. Sharp, composed, eyes scanning the room until they found his father. "Dad?" Jamie asked, stepping forward. The room turned to him. Douglas turned to Grayson. "Wait, he's your son?" Jamie approached and extended his hand. "Didn't expect to see you here." Grayson smiled. "Just visiting old ghosts." One of the former classmates whispered, "That's Jamie Bennett. He owns this place." Another gasped, "Wait, owns it?" Jamie turned to the group. "Yes, and I'd appreciate it if everyone here treated my father with the respect he's always deserved." Grayson nodded politely. "I'm fine, son." Jamie smiled. "I know, but now they know too." At that moment, the hierarchy of the room shattered. The sons of Grayson's former classmates, now working in Jamie's company, sat wide-eyed. Douglas, shaken, realized his own son was likely employed by the very boy he once mocked by extension. Grayson stepped back, letting the silence linger. And then he quietly returned to his seat, picked up his glass, and sipped slowly. No longer invisible, no longer underestimated, just seen. The room had fallen into a stunned, reverent silence. For years, Grayson Bennett had hidden behind the name Greg Bell, behind a humble uniform, behind a life of quiet obscurity. But in one moment, the illusion cracked, not by design, not through arrogance, but through circumstance. And the truth, now whispered at every table, floated through the air heavier than any fine wine or polished decor. He wasn't a security guard. He was the man whose name still echoed through boardrooms and investment circles. The man whose net worth was whispered in 9-digit estimates. The man whose disappearance had once inspired endless speculation. Tabloids, think pieces, books. And now, he sat here aged and calm, holding a glass of water, while the very people who had laughed at him tried to comprehend what stood in front of them. But what shook them even more was the realization that the restaurant they stood in, this opulent masterpiece, didn't belong to Grayson. It belonged to his son, Jamie Bennett. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand recognition. He stood with the same quiet confidence Grayson once wore like armor in his younger years. The way he looked at his father spoke volumes, words of love, understanding, and perhaps even apology for ever having doubted the man who had shaped his entire being. "I'm sorry, I didn't know," Jamie said as the murmurs quieted again. "But I understand now why you never told me." Grayson nodded slowly. "You became who you are because you thought I had nothing to give you. That's exactly what I hoped for." "But you gave me everything," Jamie replied. Douglas Hill, who had moments earlier tried to have Grayson removed, now sat with his shoulders hunched, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hollow. I didn't know." Grayson looked at him, not with revenge, not with anger, but with a calm that only life's deepest scars could grant. "No, you didn't," he said. "But even if you did, would it have changed the way you treated someone you thought was beneath you?" No response came. Jamie stepped closer. "Mr. Hill, your son Trevor works in our kitchen program. He's a good man, respectful, kind, everything you weren't tonight." Douglas winced. Grayson continued. "The irony is, most of your sons, those you raised to look down on people like me, they now work for my son. And they don't even know it." Across the restaurant, several young employees, hearing the unfolding truth, began exchanging glances, connecting dots that hadn't made sense until now. The maitre d' approached discreetly. "Mr. Bennett, your private dining room is available if you'd prefer something quieter." Grayson shook his head. "No need. I've eaten in silence long enough." Jamie turned to the group. "We can all stay, if everyone's still hungry." No one dared say no. Dinner resumed, though now the conversations were stilted, fragmented by the weight of what had been revealed. Some people tried to apologize, others simply avoided eye contact. A few, too proud or too stunned, stayed quiet entirely. But Grayson spoke to everyone who approached him. He didn't gloat. He didn't correct their misconceptions. He listened. Occasionally, he shared a story from his days as a lowly security guard, stories that now held a different kind of gravity. To many in the room, this dinner became a turning point. To Jamie, it became a moment of awakening. After dessert was served and the plates cleared, Jamie invited his father outside. They stepped onto the balcony, the city skyline twinkling beyond the glass. "I kept waiting for a moment like this," Jamie said quietly, "where everything made sense." Grayson looked at his son with steady eyes. "You didn't need it to make sense. You were already doing everything right." "But I thought you were struggling," Jamie admitted. "I thought I had to succeed to make life better for you." "And that's exactly why I let you think that," Grayson replied, "because if you knew what I had, you would have leaned on it. And then you would have built my legacy, not your own." Jamie took a deep breath. "Does this mean you're stepping back in, taking your name back?" Grayson shook his head. "No, I've lived long enough in the background to know that's where I belong. The world doesn't need another billionaire on a stage. But it might need a father who's proud enough to step into the light for his son." Jamie nodded slowly. Then let's do this together. Your way. Quiet, but powerful. They stood in silence for a few minutes, the wind tugging at their collars, the hum of the city wrapping around them like a second skin. Inside, the reunion had scattered into hushed conversations. Douglas Hill sat in the corner, slowly piecing together every misjudgment of his life. His son, Trevor, unaware of the drama, worked diligently in the kitchen, plating desserts that would bear the name of a restaurant he didn't even know his boss owned. And Grayson? He watched it all with a bittersweet calm. 18 years ago, he walked away from everything to raise a son who would never feel entitled. Tonight, he walked back into that world, not to reclaim his title, but to bear witness to something far greater, the legacy of a man who became a giant not by being rich, but by staying small long enough to raise someone greater than himself. And when the lights dimmed and the last guest stepped into the night, Jamie and Grayson walked out together, father and son, man and mirror, the past and future in quiet harmony. The boy who thought his father had nothing now knew he had been given everything. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful life stories. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from?